Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 5 of the 2021 Racial Justice Summit. This session is Racial Justice and the Media. My name is Denise Balkissoon, and I am on Peru for PIF at Narwhal. So I just want to let you know that there is simultaneous French translation, which can be accessed by clicking interpretation on the bottom right of your screen. And on my screen, that's in the the globe button. So it's the more, and then you can get French translation there. I'm pleased to be coming to you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So before we start, we will show a short video to acknowledge the sponsors of this summit. Right, thank you to all of our sponsors. This session will focus on the theme of racial justice and media and brings together diverse experts in the field to discuss their current work on media response and the impact on racialized communities. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today, and I hope you'll benefit from our panel of insightful and knowledgeable speakers. While the past year may have brought more widespread media attention to ongoing struggles for racial justice, media coverage of racial issues is still fraught with challenges. Increased media coverage on its own cannot be taken at face value, and questions still remain. Who is telling the stories of racialized communities, and how are these stories being told? How is the media landscape changing to reflect inclusivity, and is it changing fast enough? These are some of the questions we will do our best to address with our panel. So let me introduce you to our panel. Shree Paradkar is a Toronto Star columnist who writes on anti-oppression and social justice issues. She is also the country's first internal ombud, a position created to develop an anti-racist newsroom. She is the 2018-2019 recipient of the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy and winner of 2 Amnesty Awards for human rights reporting. Last year, Shree won the Racial Justice in Media Award from the Urban Alliance of Race Relations. Hi, Shree. Mohamed Elmi is the Director of Research at the Diversity Institute. The Diversity Institute conducts and coordinates multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder research to address the needs of diverse Canadians, the changing nature of skills and competencies, and the policies, processes, and tools that advance economic inclusion and success. Mohamed holds a PhD in Information Systems at University of Cape Town. Hi, Mohamed. Kim Wheeler has brought positive Indigenous stories to mainstream and Indigenous media since 1993. She's carved out a career as a writer, publicist, and producer across a variety of disciplines. Her audio work has been recognized by New York festivals and Imagine Native. Currently, Kim works from her Treehouse Media office with multiple clients in publicity, magazines, film, and podcasts. She's also the host of The Kim Wheeler Show on SiriusXM and a host producer on the podcast Anti Up. Hi, Kim. And last but not least, we have Sonya Fatah, who joined Ryerson University School of Journalism in 2017 and is currently an assistant professor. She has taught at other journalism schools both in Canada and in India and has taught feature writing, law and ethics, social issues in journalism, narrative writing, magazine workshop, and reporting and writing. Over the last 2 years, she's co-led the Ryersonian and the Ryerson Review of Journalism. Most of Sonia's working life as a journalist was spent overseas in India and Pakistan, covering South Asia for Canadian and U.S. publications. She was reporter on assignment for the Globe and Mail and later a special correspondent for the Toronto Star. She was India correspondent for the Boston-based Global Post, which is now PRI, and while in India, she wrote a column on India-Pakistan issues for the Times of India, the world's largest paper by circulation and readership. So thank you all for being here. This is going to be a really great discussion about something that I myself have thought about for probably all of my career, not just the past year. So let's begin by exploring these issues, starting with what's not working. I'm gonna go to everyone, and could you let me know what do you see as the main challenges when telling the stories of racialized communities? So Shree, let's start with you.
Okay. Thanks, Denise. That was a generous introduction, and thank you to the Urban Alliance for having me here. This, a great panel here, and I think I should actually just be keeping quiet and listening to the rest of them. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Like you, Denise, these are not, issues that I have thought about only in the last 1 year. And in fact, I'm a little suspicious of people who start to say, well, I began to think about this last year, and they're in senior positions of media. And I think, oh my God, so you're just starting now and you have this senior position, and now we have to train you. So that, this is a problem that it has for so long not even registered. So when we talk about this being a serious issue for decades, we're not talking just years, but decades, and in fact, even a century, this is only now starting to be on the radar of some senior people. That alone, I think, tells me how not seriously this issue of racism in the media has been taken. I also see this as not just a Canadian media problem, but globally. I think the so-called reckoning is the understanding, I hope, that the media sees itself as part of an oppressive ecosystem, as the perpetuator and the upholder of that oppressive ecosystem around the world, not just an objective chronicler of events as it has prided itself to be. And so that reckoning actually should call for massive introspection, but I don't see that happening. The challenge I find today is around homogeneity, the homogeneity of the gatekeepers, not just in race, which is white, but also in class, which is mostly middle class, upper middle class, and also in geography. In Toronto, for instance, there is no research, but anecdotally, I'm willing to bet that a vast majority of people live either at High Park or at the beach and Riverdale areas. So even geographically, even if you may be of another race, that becomes your focal point. And so that level of homogeneity, even had this been a fully white society, that level of homogeneity would have meant that we would still be not equitable to all the readers, even if they were all white. And so the system, the representation that we have in media is not set up for it to be equal to racialized communities. And so what happens when we have gatekeepers who are all like-minded, who are not used to being challenged and who view challenge with a certain contempt, is that what they see as important is narrow-minded or narrow. Whom they see as a culprit is a problem, and whom they see as innocent also becomes problematic. These are not objective and universal views, but they themselves think that these are universal views. So, for instance, when the Ontario Premier Doug Ford recently said about immigrants that essentially he meant to say we really need immigrants, but he ended up saying you can come here if you're going to work your tail off, and not if you're going to take advantage of our system, or you're not just going to sit around and do nothing. Well, there were media that said it was just wrongly spoken. He's not xenophobic because after all, he's saying we want immigrants to come. But and so there was this automatic assumption that, well, if he's saying we want immigrants, then he cannot be xenophobic. So it takes the narrowest conceivable idea of what xenophobia is from a white innocence perspective, and says Doug Ford really was not xenophobic for saying that if you are, that you will be judged, or your value is only tied to your labor if you're a person of color. Because all of us know that immigrant today does not mean an immigrant from the UK, right? Immigrant is code for a racialized person. So, and then also in terms of the problem also is that there is a lack of effort then in unpacking a true story, of what's really happening, because the standard of nuance and compassion that is employed in in covering stories, tragedies, joys, and challenges that are faced by white people is not employed for non-white people. So I'm not even going to say racialized, I'm not even going to say BIPOC, I think we clearly mean non-white people. Non-white and also not middle-class white people. And so this is a problem. And so I'll just give one quick example and I'll stop there, which was in 2017. I don't know if you recall, there was a man, I think his name was Wasim Khan. He was a photographer and he saw the police somewhere in downtown. There was a homeless man and he spat on someone at a shelter and police were called. And then this man saw the police yanked this guy out of the police car. His head is on the floor and the police was kicking this man on his head. And he started photographing it. Like he started, I think, taking a video, and then the police said, no, you can't take a video of this. And the entire story in the media at the time was about the rights of the citizen to film police in action, which is a valid story. At the same time, I still remember asking senior editors, what about the guy who was beaten? What about him? And an editor actually called, assigned someone to call the police. And then the police said, oh, no, he's known to us. And when I followed up, the editor said, well, he's known to police. And that was it. No, there was no other further conversation required because it was so coded that when the minute the police said he was known to police, it was the authority that the police said that meant that he was not innocent. And it meant that it was not worth even covering. And rather than seeing the police as a vested, as a party with a vested interest in this story, they were seen as an outside authoritative force. So these are major issues that we need to look at that go beyond just representation in the media. Representation, and by the way, just a quick point, I think of representation, hiring more people of color as just inclusion. That I don't see that as the solution to the transformative change that we need.
Thanks, Shree. So I'm going to move to Mohamed. What do you see as the main challenges in getting the stories of racialized communities told?
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me okay. First of all, I want to echo Shree's comments. Thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and the Urban Alliance on Race Relations for inviting me to talk about this very, very important issue. I think more and more Canadians are beginning to understand that there's racism in Canada. We see that 20 years ago when Olympian Donovan Bailey called out Canada for its racism, he was heavily criticized that no, Canada can't be a racist society and racism doesn't exist. And that was not too long ago. I think generally what we're starting to see is more and more Canadians are beginning to accept this fact. Our own Prime Minister is willing to acknowledge that there's systemic racism. And so we shouldn't be surprised that when racialized Canadians are dramatically underrepresented and underrepresented in senior leadership positions in the corporate boards and decision-making roles, as our research at the Diversity Institute has shown. Last year, the first study of its kind looked at over 9,000 corporate and board positions specifically across 8 cities. And we found that there were only 13 Black individuals in those boards, 13. And you will remember this became a very big issue last year when George Floyd's murder happened to be caught on tape by a bystander. And that resonated not just in the US, not just in North America, but worldwide. And so we know, and we've been talking about how discourse is important, how representation is important, what people see and what people hear about others through the mediums that, newspapers, television, radio. We know that how much of an impact the media has in shaping perceptions about particular groups within society. And oftentimes, how that story is shaped, and I'll just give an illustration of this. When stories about Black individuals in the media in the 1980s used to talk about Black individuals, you'd often see them described as Jamaican. And in the 1990s, there was a shift that happened where you'd often talk about, Somalis, and everybody would understand what that meant in the media. So my colleague, my former colleague, I still miss her very much, Ruby, who's going to be one of our moderators in the breakout session, has looked at the perception of how Muslims are portrayed in the media and how that has trickled down in how Muslims are portrayed. The stories often portray them as homogenous, monolithic identity, extended to other groups as well. So another point, I think, just to lay the groundwork for this discussion, is to understand that research on media literacy shows that news media portrayals also impact the self-image and confidence and achievement among members of specific groups. Well, I had the pleasure of working on a particular project in 2017 where we looked at representation across evening news broadcasts in the city of Toronto. And oftentimes what we saw, and this just extends to other studies in other parts of the world, where we saw who was chosen to be an expert to be on those news shows. Oftentimes, if it had to do with finance, the economy, things that are viewed as typically male, you would often have an expert who's a man to talk about those issues. And then when you're talking about arts and entertainment, the people who would come talk about that tended to be women. And so you see how that trickles down. A fascinating thing that we often do, we work, where the Diversity Institute is the home to the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. And one thing that we did was just to look at discourse, type in entrepreneurship in your Google search, and who comes up as a typical entrepreneur. It's usually not women, and it's usually not women of color, racialized women. And so we've been trying to understand, how do you redefine what entrepreneurship is? Tech and governments are putting money into technology. And if you find a tech angle, you'll find investors, things like that. But how do you talk about most small businesses, where a good chunk are run by women, and oftentimes small businesses run by women? How do you include them into the discussion in the types of supports that government provide, and how their stories can get out? So I could keep going on with the various examples, but I just want to pause and just tell you about how we frame it in our research, in our in all of the projects that we do. We look at it from a holistic approach. We use an ecological framework to often guide our discussion. So you look at the individual level, which is the person that who's living this day to day. Is it about skills? Is it about experience? Is it about networks? You look at it from an organizational perspective, and in this case, the media room, and the decision makers. And then you look at it from a society level. So the ecological model comes from public health. The campaigns on, for example, losing weight or quitting smoking often say, lose weight, quit smoking. It's that easy. But we know there are a variety of interlocking factors that are both at the individual level and at the larger societal level. So this means that things are not islands unto themselves. They're interacting and other factors that are beyond one individual's control. And we have to acknowledge that systemic racism exists. And how do we then go beyond that? So I'll pause there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. So I'm going to move on to Kim. Kim, can you tell me, along with what you see as the main challenges for racialized communities in general, can you also talk about your personal experience bringing Indigenous stories to the mainstream?
Sure, thank you, Anine, Sago. I just want to acknowledge that I am on the lands of Treaty 1 territory, also known as Winnipeg, the heart of Turtle Island, and it's been a gathering place for Indigenous First Nations people since time immemorial. Some of the main challenges that I see in bringing Indigenous story to the mainstream is really the type of language we use, and I'm not talking Indigenous language, but how we refer to people, how we describe people. This morning I was interviewing a climate change campaigner, and I introduced him as an activist, but I knew that wasn't the right word because I feel like the term activist has become another stereotype on when we start talking to Indigenous people. And, you know, we have to really think about how we use language to convey what we are talking about when we tell Indigenous story. I also agree with Shree when she said the senior positions in media, in the newsrooms, are an issue because they didn't learn about Indigenous people in their school, in high school, in university. And well, that makes me angry. Sometimes I feel like I don't want to blame them, but they have this opportunity to learn and change. And I think that part of it is they're afraid of their loss of power, that the non-Indigenous people out there who are in those positions don't want to see the world in a different way because they are afraid to give up those senior leadership positions because they pay really well, right? And they've worked hard to get where they are, but sometimes you have to make space for other voices. And this is what I've been doing in my career, is making space for the voices that have not been traditionally heard. I feel that it has changed a lot in the last decade. Definitely. Before, when I started my career 28 years ago, it was difficult to have an Indigenous story in the mainstream that was positive. And when my editors saw that I was only pitching positive Indigenous story, they took me aside and they asked me if I was afraid of ghettoizing myself. And that question used to drive me crazy because they never asked that about political writers or entertainment writers or sports writers or anybody who has a special niche of non-Indigenous journalists. And I always threw that back at them, and they always said, "Oh, I never thought about that. That never occurred to me." So we have to really get them to think differently about how they see the world. And we do need them to consider changing their leadership style and really having an understanding and a respect of the community and give up the divide and conquer attitude. Um, and again, it goes back to language. We are not a pan-Indigenous country. We have there are over 600 different reserves in the country. Um, over 60, I think like 60 different indigenous languages. What what works in the East doesn't work in the West. What is happening in the North isn't happening in the South. And so when we are writing or talking about the Indigenous media or Indigenous story, we have to stop using that term Indigenous as all encompassing and start boiling it down to Cree and Ojibwe and Mohawk, and just go on and on. I usually like to go in alphabetical order, like Anishinaabe, Blood, Cree, Dene, and really get to understand the Indigenous people of this land and think about the way that we are treating that story. Um, and that can't happen unless you have that knowledge and that willingness to try and understand who we are and where we're coming from as Indigenous people. The other part of the question was, can you just remind me of the other part of the question, Denise?
Oh, sure. Well, what has your experience been? And, when you say things have gotten a lot better in the past 10 years, don't discount how much you had to do with that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I had to write a very braggy bio for Jennifer Podemski yesterday, and she said, like really think about all the stuff that you have done to change Indigenous story in this country throughout the course of your career. And I realized that, yeah, like I have been not afraid to stand up and use my voice and make a stand against senior managers who I thought were wrong. And I have quit jobs. I have, you know, taken taken a match and set the bridge on fire the first time I left the CBC, and the second time I napalmed the fuck out of that bridge. and, and I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm on a do not hire list. But having said that, I also worked hard to push for change at the CBC. I was part of a small team with Connie Walker and Duncan McHugh to get the comments shut down on Indigenous story. I worked really hard to capitalize Indigenous and use the word, even though I said don't use the word Indigenous, we still do, but to capitalize the word Indigenous and move away from using the word Aboriginal. But if you're going to use that word, still capitalize it, right? Because it should be capitalized just like Black should be capitalized. Um, the Yeah, I just felt like at the beginning of my career, all I was reading was negative story about Indigenous people, and I knew that there was room for positive Indigenous story, and that's what I set out to do. I set out to write positive Indigenous stories about Indigenous people, because if I didn't care enough about my community to write about it, who was going to care enough to write about it? And that has given me, really um, working within that niche has given me a career that has lasted almost 3 decades. And I haven't been afraid to just stick with print, but I've gone on to radio, I've worked in film, I work in podcasting, and story is story is story. And wherever you can put your passion and create space is where you're going to find me. And we're doing that with the latest podcast that I'm working on, called Anti-Up, with Tanya Talaga and Jolene Banning as our co-host and executive producer. And we created this because we wanted to have a space for Indigenous women's voices exclusively, where we shared our perspectives without a colonial lens on it. And so all the work that I've done throughout my career and Tanya and Jolene have done, I feel it's led us to this moment where we have created this space, we've made this space to bring in Indigenous women across the country to talk about what they want to talk about without the fear of being censored.
Thank you. And so now, Sonya, along with telling us what you think the biggest challenges are, can you also tell us a bit about your research and what your research into Canada's newsrooms have told you about what needs to change?
Yeah, thank you, Denise, and thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to hear what everyone has to say, and completely agree with how Shree positioned some of the challenges, and I really appreciate hearing what you've had to say came about charting the road for 3 decades, which is very difficult and exhausting work to have to do. So I just want to self-locate a little bit. I'm an immigrant and a settler in this country, and it takes coming to this country to actually discover that. And it takes a while before you discover it, which is an interesting challenge that I think we have in terms of the um, immigrant-settler relationship that takes a long time um, to acknowledge. And I think that self-location is something that I try and get my students to do in our classes more and more, which is not something that journalists are comfortable doing typically. And I think it's part of a process to try and address the fact that you bring what you bring into the room or into your reporting, which is kind of pushing aside or pushing against this idea that Shree, you were also talking about, which is the problem of objective chronicling of history, which, as we all know, is bogus. Um, I'm trying to think of the challenges, for this is such a big conversation, and it's hard to distill it into a clear, short, and concise issue. But I think if I was to think of 3 areas that are critical here, I would say the one challenge is that we all are attached to um, colonial systems of operation at all levels, right? And that, I mean, like in every facet of our life, the system is a colonized system, which means that it starts with our education. I think, Kim, you talked about this. Like, what do you learn in school? The kids are still going to pioneer villages in Ontario, which is a huge problem in terms of both your own inclusion, in terms of where you see yourself in that history, but also what elements of history are completely removed from this kind of pastoral, idyllic, hardworking image of settler life in Canada. But my point being that those are the systems of knowledge on which people are educated and what they bring into their different professions. And so journalists, like everybody else, have gone through the same systems. And they are then expected to report on these critical issues with this mantle of, like, we are the fourth estate, which is a huge problem, because it puts journalists on this kind of podium of untouchability, which makes it impossible to critique journalists. I mean, I think that's shifting, as we all know, because of the conversations in the public sphere. But I think the idea of journalists as fourth estate is part of the problem, because it means that we're not there is no real interrogation of the journalist's voice, nor is there regulation of the journalist's voice, and it becomes the voice of truth. And I think you hear journalists talk a lot about the truth as if it is like a singular narrative. And so we really pushing against the idea of pushing against that is really difficult, because I think that is something that journalists totally they drink the Kool-Aid, right? So it's part of the work of pushing against that is incredibly challenging, because it's like you have to push against everything you have to relearn, you have to restart, and you have to be willing to go on that journey. So that's the system. And I think then we have the journalism organizations, where we have, as we've all talked about, a real problem of representation. And that, Denise, is part of where my research is with my colleague Asma Malik. I'm just going to show you guys. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but I just did this on my phone. This is not part of my research. This is just a snapshot. Oh, can you see this? Okay, so this is a snapshot of media executives in Canada. And I'll split up again. It's culled from all the websites of all the major media companies, but it gives you a pretty clear idea of a problem of representation just in terms of a visual idea. It's not a definitive scientific research based on self-representation, which is what we are interested in. But it gives you a snapshot about decision makers and who is in power and who is making who is at the table when they make decisions about editorial direction, or also about like what kinds of platforms you invest in and how we invest in that, and who are our audiences, and all these kind of key questions that enable you to really talk about um, shifting the narrative. Um, and I think that, I think, Mohammed, you talked about sourcing for experts and how there's a problem of representation in the media narrative. And I think that's something that we definitely have a problem with in journalism, which is the tendency to believe that people in official positions of power somehow are closer to the truth than those who are impacted by those decisions. And so this idea of who do you believe and whose truth do you believe is something we don't ask ourselves enough, right? So if you're reporting on violence in a community, and that community happens to have higher levels of violence, you're not asking the question about why is this community over policed, or what is the history of access to resources this community, or what is experiences of feelings of people in this community. Instead, the historical narrative has rested on the police officer, the police officer's version of story. And I think, Shree, you talked about this a little bit, also in terms of the decision on the case of the photographer who was filming the story, like why the decision to frame the story just around the rights of the journalist versus what was actually happening in that moment of violence. Um, so, I mean, I think that for those conversations to change, part of my research with Asma and our researcher Davide was to really ask this question, just to talk about representation as the base level, right? Representation isn't like everything, right? It's just a point of departure. So you don't finish the work just by saying, oh yeah, we hired these 5 other people and now they will do all this work, which is what tends to happen in organizations. Is the pressure is then on those people who are newly hired and they're all racialized and they're going to come and fix the problem. Shree, any thoughts on that experience in your ombudsperson role? Um, just so I think that's the idea of, we're in this age where diversity, equity, inclusion are all very much like the language of comfort for everyone, and everyone's using it, whether it's like a marketing company or an educational institution or a media organization. But I think doing a genuine audit and looking at what is the overall thing, what are our staffing numbers, what kinds of stories are we doing, what is our sourcing on those stories, whose voices are we centering in these narratives, um, uh, you know, um, who's who's at the table when we're making decisions about which stories to tell. I mean, all of those are really critical questions. And the linchpin of all of this is the journalism schools, which have become the feeder schools into the industry. So, what is the role of the journalism school in the 21st century? And my view is that the journalism school has to change. It cannot be a training school for the industry as it stands. I think the journalism school has to also consider its own filter process, like who is coming to journalism school and who is telling these stories. And once you're in J school, is the purpose of J school just to reproduce the same kind of narrative and work with the same JSPs that the industry has, or is it to push the narrative and really to experiment new ways of doing journalism, to question what norms like objectivity, to center the voices of people, to look at the historical record and to say this is where we need to go from here, and we're going to try and experiment with new forms of journalism, and encourage the new generation not to just feel angry about the past, but to find a way to move forward. So I've said a lot and I'm taking up a lot of space here. So I'll wait. I'll stop here and pass it back to you, Denise.
Thanks so much, Sonya. Um, I mean, one of the things that I really feel, which I think draws on what you all have said, is that there really is a missing middle. So when we say that there aren't racialized people in senior leadership, I think a lot of that is because, these fresh-faced young grads come out of J school or they start, and they do really great things. And then when they get to the point where they might want to advance in their careers, their newsroom is quite hostile to them, and many of them drop out. Um, and so, Shree, I wanted to ask you, you know, even though there's this like base representation, often of very young people, the newsrooms aren't always safe or responsive to the needs of this kind of staff. Could you tell us a bit about what it's been like since you were appointed as the Star's internal ombudsperson? How has it been? How has it been sort of being the intermediary there?
Hmm. Thanks for asking that. Um, when this role was instituted 1 year ago, we thought, it would take 1 day of the week, as in not one full day, but the total hours in a week would be the equivalent of 1 day in a week. And so I used to write 3 columns a week. So I said, okay, I'll just do 2 columns a week, and then I'll keep one, that rest of that time for people. Right now, I can tell you, I barely managed to write 1 column a week. It's not just a symptom that, oh, there are all these problems at the Toronto Star, because what's happening is I'm getting there are more and more people empowered to speak up, to ask me those questions in the Toronto Star, but also other Toronto Star media, and also increasingly people not at the Star at all, journalists from outside, who might have issues in their organizations, were saying, hey, what are you doing about it? So it's a much wider role in so many ways than just being an internal ombud at the Star alone. So any of my experiences that I'll talk about will not just be the Star, but generally industry-wide. And I also want to be careful that I don't break any confidences, because a lot of these are people who are vulnerable, who've come forward and they've shared their stories. Very quickly, my job became two-pronged. One was what you just mentioned, Denise, which is being that intermediary and being a safe space so that people, and especially racialized and Indigenous, actually racialized because we have no Indigenous journalists, so racialized people would feel safe to come forward with their issues, whether it's with assignment, whether it's with how they're treated or otherwise. And then the other was soon around creating initiatives so that the entire newsroom would have practices that are anti-racist, so that these problems that some of the journalists are coming forward would not continue to happen. My ultimate goal is that my job shouldn't exist, right? I'll be happy to go back to being a columnist. But in the course of helping people or being that intermediary, it's help like, how to pitch stories. It's around, I was assigned this, I'm not comfortable with this, around, can I get some training on this, around, I'm not a good fit with this person because this is how they keep speaking to me, and it's a racialized person, and that and the person is just completely colorblind. And so it's around making sure that they're in a place where they're comfortable. So these are all expected issues. Sometimes it's also around bullying, issues which has nothing to do with somebody being racialized, or it may be something to do with them being racialized. But so it's around all of that. Bigger issues would be, I don't know if you all remember, sometime I think it was in the late spring that journalists around Canada had signed an open letter to Canadian media on the Middle East, and how one-sided the Canadian media was in covering an Israeli perspective, but not giving any time of day to the Palestinian perspective. And I know I signed it, and I gave my name there, and I signed my name as well. But then then I noticed that in a lot of other media, people just signed their names, but they didn't say where they were from. And in some of them they did. And then the next day, there was this whole, it was like an explosion in various organizations, such as the Globe and Mail and the CBC. There was going to be all these repercussions on the journalists who had signed that. But fortunately at the Star, for me, because my position existed, we had that same kind of unease in senior management, but they came to me to say, okay, what's really going on here? And I found that, yeah, I could actually play interpreter, where I was able to explain, to say, they are not being objective, they're asking you to be more objective, and this is how they're doing it. They're actually doing their job, they're telling you that you're not doing yours. And so it was, it's and as a result, at the end, like they were at the end, and perhaps right from the beginning, they were like, no, these journalists are not going to have any, like, there's not going to be any backlash against them for having signed this, which I think made it a safe space immediately, that they didn't have to go through that process of perhaps having backlash, which I know that the Globe walked back because there was enough protest from the union. So the Globe walked back its backlash that was going to happen. But so, there are lots of little things, which sometimes is about translation. Sometimes it's about training, just every conversation I find can be a training session. And sometimes it is about handling fragility, whether it's, in any organization. And I think a lot of sometimes the problem is a very human one, that when we are talking about, for instance, how we cover police, the actual conversation, the subtext of that conversation, often for a very senior editor, is we are saying, however you've been doing this for the last 30 years has been wrong. And it would take, I don't think any of us likes to be told what we are doing is wrong, or that what we've done all this time has been everything, all our lives, our entire life's work has just been wrong. It would take extraordinary humility for someone to accept that. So, but they have to, it's reality, and nobody is talking about their intentions. So sometimes that becomes a really difficult conversation. It's also difficulty around understanding trans rights. And then I think, I created this set of anti-bias guidelines along with the team. So we have that on the go, how to write about trans issues, or just in terms of terms, how to be more trauma informed in your approaches. And all of that is okay. It's the biggest challenge still across the industry is in how we approach a story. We can't have carbon offsets. What's happening right now is you'll have a story that says, let's say, for instance, genocide of, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry should not have used the word genocide. Well, okay, thanks for weighing in, colonizer. But so you have that point of view from editorials saying we shouldn't do that. But then they might have an article from some Indigenous person who says, well, the genocide was right, and it was okay to use that. And so the justification is, we did a carbon offset. We had this point of view, but we also had that point of view. And really, is that the kind of justice we're talking about? Is that the role that we want our media to play, where we are giving, insulting views, that kind of a platform to say it's a valid view? So yeah, I think it's challenging, and depending on which day you catch me, some days I'm optimistic. Today I'm like, we've had, ever since the big reckoning from last year, we've had like incremental shifts, but I don't see any transformational change yet. You're muted, Denise.
Oh. Okay, now can you hear me? Yes, all right. So this conversation has gone really well, and as always, there's so much to say. So it's almost time to go in the breakout rooms. I'd like to remind all the audience members that there are two breakout rooms. One is on BIPOC journalists, and the other is on media coverage. So there's a slide that's gone up about how you can choose which one. If you are joining from a browser instead of on the Zoom app, you unfortunately can't choose. So can you put in your Zoom name which one you'd like, either BIPOC or COV for media coverage? And our technical crew will move you after this discussion. So what I'm going to do is give everyone a lightning round, 1 minute. And as Shree said, some days we feel optimistic and some days we don't. So up to you. You can either say a solution that you have seen work or that you hope, that you see on the horizon. Or if you're having a downer day, you can say, why do you think we have to keep having these conversations over and over and over? All right, so your choice. And Kim is the first person I see on my screen. So Kim, what?
Oh, you've muted yourself again, Denise. But we'll just go with that lightning round. Am I having a down day or am I having an up day? It goes back and forth every single time. So I was having an up day when I spoke with Clayton and we talked about language, and how, for my show, I give my um, my interviewees the opportunity to speak without being edited. It's a live to tape situation. So even me, I don't control their narrative. I don't change. I don't edit them. I will clean them up a little bit, but yeah, I give them the space. And then I think about the conversation that I had with a friend of mine who is in a senior leadership position with a mainstream media outlet. And, I thought I was hopeful that things have been changing, but she has said that there's still so much work to do, and it really is disheartening. When I talk about my time at the CBC, and that wasn't the only mainstream media outlet I worked at, I call them tours of duty. So I've had 2 tours of duty with the CBC, and that's exactly what it feels like. It feels like you're in the trenches and you're fighting every day to change the narrative and to challenge senior leadership to look at journalism in a different way.
Thank you. Okay, so Mohamed, do you want to tell us a solution or do you want to tell us why we're still talking about this over and over? Up to you.
So I feel like I need to do the researcher thing where I hedge my answer a little. Generally, I am optimistic that things are changing. I do see a recognition more within society that things have to change for the better. I want to say a solution for somebody in my shoes is we need disaggregated data. I think that is probably the biggest issue we have. Statistics Canada uses this grouping, visible minority, where it groups everybody together, and you don't know differences within that very, very, very broad sector. So a very good example is not very many people know that 60% of Black Canadians are actually immigrants, 60%. So there's that intersectionality that often is missing from that discussion. And there are Canadians who are here, Black Canadians who came here literally with one of the first boats that came on the shores of the country with the European colonizers. That's not known very, very much. And so understanding that there are differences even within that very, very large term, Black Canadian, African Canadian itself, and the nuances and the differences within that community needs disaggregated data. So if I was to offer a solution, one solution today would be that.
Thank you. The category visible minority is so extremely irritating to me. Even as a journalist, when you're looking into research, you know that it's not telling you what you need to know. So Sonya, do you want to give us a solution and or tell us why we keep having this conversation over and over?
I think I'm going to try doing both because I think the solution requires us to keep having the conversation over and over. And I think that it does help to have those conversations and to hear perspectives and to hear even though there might be some people tiring from the conversation and there may be a reaction to the conversation, which we are seeing happening in pockets. Um, I feel somewhat optimistic. I know what Kim is saying, which is that dreary, awful, you know, um, tours of duty in the trenches is real, and I know a lot of people are living that. But I think I'm sitting in the institution um, that has a lot of problems, and I do want to mention that our publications are no longer known as Ryerson Review of Journalism and the Ryersonian. They have since changed their names. It's now the Review of Journalism and On the Record, which came out of a process of considering name changes given the legacy of Igor and Ryerson. But I feel like part of the challenge is that a lot of our media work is focused on traditional, or our emphasis is on mainstream legacy publications. Um, and I think that a lot of young journalists are going out into the gig economy. So they're not getting those plum jobs anymore. You know, if you could call them plum jobs, they don't exist. But I feel like this is an age of experimentation, and certainly I'm trying to foster that at the School of Journalism, where we're trying to create more avenues to try journalism differently, to reconsider these ideas of objectivity, to think about, you know, even the language. What is the word journalist? It comes from the word journal. What is journal? Someone keeping a record. Who was keeping the record? The colonizers keeping the record of the people. And, you know, if you think about how all of these histories are connected, I think you can only move forward if you recognize the past and connect with it and center it around like the future. So I feel like a lot of the distinction is going to come from partly what Mohamed is saying, data collection and more granular data collection. I think that part of my research is looking at representation in newsrooms, and having that data with which the Canadian media ecosystem is extremely uncomfortable about sharing, because they know what it looks like, and sharing that kind of data reflects the problem. But you cannot fix a problem you can't see. So you have to start with the data, and then you go, you know, forward with that. So I feel like more experimentation in terms of approaches to journalism, being more open to how we are working with our sources, changing up some of this very aggressive, like we know the truth kind of mantra that has been the way in which journalism is done, is happening. And I can see it in our classrooms. I can see it in the next generation of kids who don't believe, who don't have the same kind of veneration for systems, who don't have the same kind of respect for, and who recognize that the historical record is really faulty and want to play a part in changing that.
Thank you. Um, all right, and then Shree, last but not least, where how are you feeling today?
Yeah, I mean, we do have to keep talking about it. I think the one reason we need data is, normally I would say, yeah, you need to see the problem to recognize it. But frankly, we all know what the problem is. I think the one good use of data would be for shaming, for embarrassing, because that seems to be the only thing that works. Major challenge, of course, is that if media organizations are for profit, then there is an inherent tension between and the idea of social justice, which the media is supposed to uphold, and a for-profit motive. So that itself is a major structural change. And because it's a for-profit, major organizations approach anything about racism from a reputational risk perspective rather than a justice perspective. And so something like data is great to shame them or to pressure them. There's going to also be, you know, and I don't know how the financial stuff breaks down. Like if writing about racism gets a ton of subscribers, yeah, media is going to cover that. But if writing the other way, if talking about Maxime Bernier is also going to get a ton of subscribers, then where is the incentive for media to not do it? So I'm very leery of having to justify why racialized and Indigenous people should be covered, because, you know, we don't justify why white people should be covered. So it should be the same reason. It's because we are all human. And it shouldn't be attached to a profit motive. It should be because it is inherently right. So yeah, that's where I am.
All right, well, thank you all very much, and I hope you all enjoy your breakout sessions.